I never imagined a simple letter could turn my life upside down. It came in the mail one chilly Tuesday morning. I was sipping my coffee, scrolling through emails, when I saw it lying on the counter, a crisp, official envelope with the HOA's logo stamped at the top. My stomach sank. I already knew what it was before I even opened it. Inside was a notice, a $1,000 fine for violating some obscure HOA rule. They claimed I had unauthorized modifications to my property. I blinked. Me? Unauthorized modifications? I had spent months carefully following every guideline they had ever handed me. Every paint color, every hedge trim, every fence post, everything approved, documented, photographed. How could they accuse me of breaking the rules? I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the paper. My hands shook slightly, not from anger, but from disbelief. This wasn't just money. This was a statement. They were trying to assert control over me, over my home, over my life. And they were using threats and fines to do it. I remembered the years of tension building up in this neighborhood. The HOA had always been strict, sure, but lately, it felt different. There were whispers among neighbors about favoritism, secret meetings, decisions made behind closed doors. I'd always kept my head down, followed the rules, and stayed out of their politics. Until now. The fine wasn't just unfair, it was personal. I could feel it. I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. And yet, here it was, staring me in the face, demanding a payment I couldn't ignore. I thought about paying it, hoping it would just make the problem go away, but deep down, I knew that giving in would only embolden them. They were testing me, and I refused to be the person who folded. I remembered a conversation I'd had with a neighbor last year. She had faced a similar situation. The HOA had fined her for something trivial, something that wasn't even illegal. She had paid, and the next week, they fined her again for another minor violation. That's when I realized this wasn't just about rules, it was about power. That afternoon, I walked through my yard, looking at everything I'd done. My freshly painted fence, my manicured flower beds, my new gate, all approved. Everything compliant. Everything perfect. And yet, the HOA claimed I was in violation. I felt a mix of anger, frustration, and disbelief bubbling up inside me. I called their office, trying to stay calm. I explained, point by point, why their claims were unfounded. I even referenced the approvals, the signed documents, the emails. The person on the other end listened, nodded politely, and then said, almost casually, "We'll review it and get back to you." But I could hear it in their tone. They didn't care. They never cared. This was routine for them, a way to assert dominance, to make people feel small. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with thoughts of justice, fairness, and revenge. I thought about all the neighbors who had warned me about the HOA's secret meetings, their underhanded tactics, their obsession with control. I thought about all the time, money, and energy I had spent making my home perfect, only to be punished for it. And that's when the first spark of an idea hit me, not a reckless, angry idea, but a calculated one. I wouldn't pay the fine. Not yet. I wouldn't beg for mercy or plead my case to people who didn't care. I would make them realize their mistake in a way they would never forget. My revenge wouldn't be loud or dramatic. It would be quiet, methodical, and satisfying, a lesson in karma delivered without a single word. Over the next few days, I observed. I watched the HOA's activities, paying attention to their schedules, their patterns, the way they interacted with residents. I noted the officers who seemed arrogant, the meetings where decisions were made behind closed doors, the rules they bent for some and enforced strictly for others. Everything I observed, I documented. Every detail could be used later, not publicly, not recklessly, but strategically. I also started reaching out to neighbors quietly, not to stir gossip or incite drama, but to understand if others had experienced similar unfair treatment. Surprisingly, many had stories that mirrored mine, fines for non-existent violations, warnings for things that weren't even against the rules, property inspections that felt invasive and personal. A network was quietly forming, and it gave me hope. One night, as I sat with my laptop, compiling notes and thinking through my plan, I realized how much power I actually had. I was smart, careful, and observant. I knew the rules better than they did. I knew the loopholes, the inconsistencies, the weaknesses in their enforcement. And most importantly, I knew I could act without them seeing it coming. By the end of that week, my anger had evolved into clarity. I wasn't just upset. I wasn't just frustrated. I was ready. Ready to reclaim control, ready to make a statement, ready to turn their own tactics against them. And the best part? They would never see it coming until it was too late. That's when I decided, I wasn't going to let a $1,000 fine define me. I wasn't going to let an unfair HOA rob me of my peace. I would fight, quietly, cleverly, and effectively. And when I was done, they wouldn't just apologize. They would remember my revenge forever. Little did I know, the plan I started sketching that night would take weeks to unfold, would test my patience, and would expose secrets I never imagined about my own neighborhood. But more than anything, it would feel like justice. Real, satisfying, undeniable justice. I never imagined a simple letter could turn my life upside down. It came in the mail one chilly Tuesday morning. I was sipping my coffee, scrolling through emails, when I saw it lying on the counter, a crisp, official envelope with the HOA's logo stamped at the top. My stomach sank. I already knew what it was before I even opened it. Inside was a notice, a $1,000 fine for violating some obscure HOA rule. They claimed I had unauthorized modifications to my property. I blinked. Me? Unauthorized modifications? I had spent months carefully following every guideline they had ever handed me. Every paint color, every hedge trim, every fence post, everything approved, documented, photographed. How could they accuse me of breaking the rules? I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the paper. My hands shook slightly, not from anger, but from disbelief. This wasn't just money. This was a statement. They were trying to assert control over me, over my home, over my life. And they were using threats and fines to do it. I remembered the years of tension building up in this neighborhood. The HOA had always been strict, sure, but lately, it felt different. There were whispers among neighbors about favoritism, secret meetings, decisions made behind closed doors. I'd always kept my head down, followed the rules, and stayed out of their politics. Until now. The fine wasn't just unfair, it was personal. I could feel it. I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. And yet, here it was, staring me in the face, demanding a payment I couldn't ignore. I thought about paying it, hoping it would just make the problem go away, but deep down, I knew that giving in would only embolden them. They were testing me, and I refused to be the person who folded. I remembered a conversation I'd had with a neighbor last year. She had faced a similar situation. The HOA had fined her for something trivial, something that wasn't even illegal. She had paid, and the next week, they fined her again for another minor violation. That's when I realized this wasn't just about rules, it was about power. That afternoon, I walked through my yard, looking at everything I'd done. My freshly painted fence, my manicured flower beds, my new gate, all approved. Everything compliant. Everything perfect. And yet, the HOA claimed I was in violation. I felt a mix of anger, frustration, and disbelief bubbling up inside me. I called their office, trying to stay calm. I explained, point by point, why their claims were unfounded. I even referenced the approvals, the signed documents, the emails. The person on the other end listened, nodded politely, and then said, almost casually, "We'll review it and get back to you." But I could hear it in their tone. They didn't care. They never cared. This was routine for them, a way to assert dominance, to make people feel small. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with thoughts of justice, fairness, and revenge. I thought about all the neighbors who had warned me about the HOA's secret meetings, their underhanded tactics, their obsession with control. I thought about all the time, money, and energy I had spent making my home perfect, only to be punished for it. And that's when the first spark of an idea hit me, not a reckless, angry idea, but a calculated one. I wouldn't pay the fine. Not yet. I wouldn't beg for mercy or plead my case to people who didn't care. I would make them realize their mistake in a way they would never forget. My revenge wouldn't be loud or dramatic. It would be quiet, methodical, and satisfying, a lesson in karma delivered without a single word. Over the next few days, I observed. I watched the HOA's activities, paying attention to their schedules, their patterns, the way they interacted with residents. I noted the officers who seemed arrogant, the meetings where decisions were made behind closed doors, the rules they bent for some and enforced strictly for others. Everything I observed, I documented. Every detail could be used later, not publicly, not recklessly, but strategically. I also started reaching out to neighbors quietly, not to stir gossip or incite drama, but to understand if others had experienced similar unfair treatment. Surprisingly, many had stories that mirrored mine: fines for non-existent violations, warnings for things that weren't even against the rules, property inspections that felt invasive and personal. A network was quietly forming, and it gave me hope. One night, as I sat with my laptop, compiling notes and thinking through my plan, I realized how much power I actually had. I was smart, careful, and observant. I knew the rules better than they did. I knew the loopholes, the inconsistencies, the weaknesses in their enforcement. And most importantly, I knew I could act without them seeing it coming. By the end of that week, my anger had evolved into clarity. I wasn't just upset. I wasn't just frustrated. I was ready. Ready to reclaim control, ready to make a statement, ready to turn their own tactics against them. And the best part? They would never see it coming until it was too late. That's when I decided, I wasn't going to let a $1,000 fine define me. I wasn't going to let an unfair HOA rob me of my peace. I would fight, quietly, cleverly, and effectively. And when I was done, they wouldn't just apologize. They would remember my revenge forever. Little did I know, the plan I started sketching that night would take weeks to unfold, would test my patience, and would expose secrets I never imagined about my own neighborhood. But more than anything, it would feel like justice. Real, satisfying, undeniable justice. Where money flowed, rules bent. That knowledge changed my plan. I needed to show the money link. I needed to find trails. I started small. I looked at public records. Building permits go on record. Donations sometimes show up in community fundraising lists. I learned which contractors worked for the developer. I found a few receipts tied to board events. Nothing illegal yet. Just uncomfortable. One afternoon, I found a short email chain that made my heart race. It was from an account that appeared to be a board member. It talked casually about handling a complaint from a difficult resident. The language was off. It felt unprofessional. I saved it. I printed it. I backed it up to the cloud. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the printed pages spread like a map. My notes were messy. My coffee sat cold. The plan had to be careful. If I went in too hard, the HOA would strike back. If I stayed too soft, nothing would change. I needed the middle road, pressure that could not be dismissed. I decided on a 3-step approach. Step 1. Build undeniable documentation. Keep proof of every interaction. Create a ledger of everything the HOA did that was questionable. Photographs. Letters. Approved permits. Meeting minutes. Witness statements. Step 2. Create a quiet coalition. Not a mob. Not a protest. A small group of neighbors who wanted fairness, who would attend meetings, who would ask questions, and who would vote when the time came. We would be organized and calm. We would be respectful. We would be persistent. Step 3. Use the HOA's own rules against them. Most HOAs have a recall process. Most allow owners to request emergency audits or to demand special meetings if a certain percentage signs a petition. Those rules were buried in pages of bylaws that many of us never read. I read them. I underlined the sections about director responsibilities and recall. The rules were dry, but they were there. If we met the requirements, the board would have to act. I shared the plan with 2 neighbors that week. Mrs. Alvarez. Mark. I kept it small. I asked if they would attend a meeting and speak up. Both agreed. Relief made me speak faster than usual. We can do this quietly, I said. We just have to follow the rules. We started attending meetings more often. We sat in the back row and listened. We took notes. At the next board meeting, when they spoke about community compliance, I raised my hand. I asked a simple question. Why are complaints anonymous? I asked. How do you verify them? The board shuffled papers. The president smiled and said, we follow procedure. It was the same evasive answer I had heard before. My heart beat faster. I felt eyes on me. A ripple of attention moved through the room. After the meeting, a board member named Len cornered me. He was about my age. His tone was friendly at first. You seem very interested, he said. We're just trying to keep the community standards. I just want fairness, I said. That's all. He hesitated, then said, we can talk later. The line was open. I had planted a seed. That night, I drafted a petition. It was short and precise. It asked for an audit of recent complaint logs and a review of the approval process for construction projects. I left copies in mailboxes of neighbors I trusted. I also left a copy on the community bulletin board for anyone else to sign. The first signatures came in slowly. Mrs. Alvarez signed and left a note. Mark's wife signed. By the end of the week, we had a dozen signatures. Not enough to force a meeting. Not yet. But it was a start. And then something unexpected happened. The HOA sent another letter. Not to me this time. To Mark. It accused him of violating a landscaping rule. The day the letter arrived, his son was homesick. He opened the envelope with shaking hands. He looked at me and said, they're trying to scare me. I realized then they were paying attention. My small moves were noticed. That scared me for a moment. Then I remembered the 3 steps. We were building facts. We were building a coalition. We were ready to use their rules. It would take time. It would test all of us. But for the first time since that $1,000 fine, I felt in control. I felt like the next move belonged to me. Little did I know, the next move would reveal something even stranger. A document that did not belong to anyone in our community. A note that would change everything and force the HOA to react in a way none of us expected. A week after the petition, I found the paper. It was folded and tucked behind a box in my garage. I almost missed it. It was plain, single-spaced, and looked like a rough memo. At first I thought it was a junk flyer. Then I read the first line and my heart stopped. It named a developer. It named an HOA board member. It listed dates. It listed amounts. It talked about expedited approvals and favors returned. It used casual language, like a shopping list. It looked like a private note between people who thought no one would ever read it. I sat down on the concrete floor. The garage smelled like oil and winter. My hands trembled as I smoothed the page. For a moment, I was afraid. If this paper proved what it suggested, it could change everything. It could explain why some rules were enforced and others were ignored. It could explain why certain builds got permission despite complaints. It could explain the $1,000 fine sitting on my counter. I did not know how it ended up in my garage. That was strange. Maybe someone dropped it. Maybe a contractor misfiled it. Maybe it was left intentionally. I could not guess. All I knew was that I had to be careful. I put the paper in my evidence folder. Then I made copies. I scanned it. I backed it up to the cloud. I kept the original safe. I told myself to breathe. I told myself to think. The next morning, I reached out to 2 neighbors I trusted. I showed them the copy. Their faces changed. Mrs. Alvarez clutched her chest. Mark looked pale. "If this is real," he said slowly, "then they've been laundering decisions." We agreed not to jump. We agreed to check facts. We did not want to accuse anyone without proof. We wanted truth. So we started small. We traced the names. We checked public permit records. We matched dates on the paper with permit approvals. We searched for public donations and charity lists. We requested receipts where possible. Piece by piece, things lined up. A variance was approved the week after a large donation to a neighborhood fundraiser. A contractor who worked for the developer had done maintenance on the HOA's common area shortly after a board vote. None of it screamed corruption in loud letters. It whispered it. It suggested patterns. It suggested preferential treatment. We added everything to our folder. Photocopies. Receipts. The memo. Permits. Emails I had saved. A few witness notes. It began to look like a case. Not a criminal case. Not yet. But a case that would matter in a community meeting, in a public hearing, or in the court of public opinion. I knew I could do 2 things. One was to confront the board directly with the evidence. The other was to take the evidence to someone outside the HOA who could act. I chose both. First, I sent a formal request for an emergency meeting. The bylaws required a special meeting if a certain percentage of owners signed a petition. We had not reached the number yet. But the memo and the matching facts felt urgent. I mailed the board a certified letter. I asked for the meeting. I attached a summary of the items we wanted discussed, the complaint process, the approval timeline for recent builds, and discrepancies in financial disclosures. Second, I contacted a local reporter. I had never done anything like that before. It felt strange. I typed a short message explaining the basics, and I attached a sanitized copy of the memo, names redacted at first. The reporter replied quickly. He wanted to meet. He wanted to see more. I met him at a diner. He was younger than I expected. He listened more than he spoke. He asked questions that cut straight to the point. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Do you want to go public?" I said I did. But I also said I wanted to do it right. I wanted facts. He nodded and said he would look into public records too. Word leaks fast in small towns. Within 2 days, whispers traveled down the street. The HOA called an informal meeting. It was not the emergency meeting we requested. It was a social coffee they held for residents to ask questions. The timing was suspicious. At that coffee, the board smiled a lot. They passed out pamphlets about community values. The president, a tidy woman named Gloria, made comforting sounds. She said the HOA had always acted in good faith. She said the board was transparent. She said they would review any concerns. Her voice was calm. Her words were practiced. But practice covers only so much. At one point, I stood up and asked about the memo. My voice was steady. Many in the room turned. Gloria's smile faltered for a second. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "They called it a misunderstanding. They called it an out-of-context document. They said they would investigate. I did not expect them to collapse under questions. I only wanted them to react. Their reaction would tell me how strong they were. The more they dodged, the weaker they looked." That night, someone, anonymously, put the memo on the community bulletin board. It was a rough photocopy. The names were not redacted. People read it in clusters. Conversations started. Tension moved like a wave through the neighborhood. Some people were angry. Some were afraid. Some were silent and close-lipped. I heard friendly voices turn sharp. I heard neighbors who once exchanged lawnmowers now whisper in front yards. The board called a formal meeting 2 weeks later. It was on a Tuesday evening. The room was packed. Chairs ran out. People stood along the walls. I sat near the front. My evidence folder was under my chair. My hands were not shaking. The meeting began with the usual script. The president read minutes. The treasurer gave a report. Then came public comments. People lined up to speak. Some spoke about damaged shrubs. Some spoke about trash. The tone was ordinary at first. Then the meeting turned. Someone in the back shouted, "Who wrote that memo?" The room buzzed. Gloria asked for order. The tension rose. It felt electric. When it was my turn, I walked to the podium. I spoke slowly. I stated facts. I did not accuse. I did not yell. I read the dates, the permits, the donations. I held up copies. I asked for answers. I asked why approvals had been granted to certain builds when others were fined. I asked why complaint logs were anonymous. I asked why documents had been redacted. The board replied with evasions. They said privacy protected certain details. They said the memo was not part of official records. They said any questions should go through the process. The crowd grew restless. Voices rose. People demanded transparency. A man in the front row shouted for an audit. The meeting ended in chaos. Some residents clapped. Some left furious. Others lingered, talking in knots. The board looked smaller. For the first time, their authority felt questioned. After the meeting, the reporter published a short piece online. The headline was careful. It did not name names at first, but it asked tough questions. It asked the county office if they had received similar complaints. It asked if the HOA had followed its bylaws. The next week, a county inspector emailed to say they had received a complaint and would review records. The HOA posted a bland notice saying they welcomed the review. The developer issued a statement saying all permits were legal. The board promised a third-party audit. I expected the audit promise. It was a common play. Promise action, then drag feet. But now the neighborhood had momentum. People who never came to meetings started asking questions. A few longtime residents who had been silent now spoke openly about favors and donations. My phone filled with messages. Some were fearful. Some were thankful. Some offered help. But the memo's presence in my garage remained a mystery. I never found who left it. I never asked out loud. The unknown nagged at me. I wondered if someone close to the board had slipped. I wondered if someone had seen me as someone who could make a difference. I wondered if luck had played a part. The truth is, I did not need to know how the paper got there. The paper had done its job. It had broken the quiet. It had forced conversations. It had made people who were afraid become angry enough to act. That night, as I walked my dog, neighbors stopped me on porches. "Thank you," they said. "We needed this." A man I barely knew, an old man who always wore a hat, touched my arm. "You did right," he said. His voice was low and steady. I slept poorly. My mind raced with possible outcomes. I felt both exhilaration and dread. We had pushed a door open. Now something larger could come through. The audit might show nothing. The board might craft a careful response and regain control. People might return to quiet lives. Or the audit might reveal more. It might show patterns of favoritism. It might show financial irregularities. Either way, the neighborhood had changed. The line between comfortable silence and public accountability had been crossed. That felt dangerous. That felt necessary. I knew the next steps would test all of us. The audit process would be slow. The developer might hire lawyers. The board might rally supporters. Some neighbors might leave, tired of drama. Some might double down in defense of the board. Pressure would rise. Tempers would flare. But for the first time since the $1,000 fine, I felt hope. The plan I had started on a kitchen table was no longer only mine. It had become a movement. Quiet. Determined. Civil. It wanted fairness. It wanted rules applied equally. Little did I know, the audit would uncover a detail so small and so easily missed that it would force one board member to resign. It would also reveal a mistake that would open the door to real accountability. But that belonged to the next part. Weeks passed slowly. The county audit had begun, but progress was agonizingly slow. Every day I checked my emails, hoping for updates, hoping for a sign that our quiet movement was making a difference. Neighbors started talking more openly. The community felt alive with tension. Some whispered behind closed doors. Some gathered in small groups at the local coffee shop. Everyone seemed to feel the invisible pressure building. I spent most of my evenings reviewing our folder again. The memo, the receipts, the permits, the emails, everything spread across the kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle. I reviewed our notes, double-checked dates, and compared complaints to approvals. Each time I looked, new connections emerged. Some were subtle, patterns of timing, patterns of favors. Some were glaring, missing documentation, unexplained approvals. The picture was becoming impossible to ignore. Then came the first email from the county inspector. I almost dropped my phone. The message was short: audit in progress. Preliminary findings show discrepancies in records. Expect a report in the coming weeks. My heart raced. Discrepancies could mean many things, but in our case, it meant validation. The first official acknowledgement that our concerns were legitimate. I shared the news with Mrs. Alvarez and Mark. Their faces lit up with cautious excitement. "This is huge," Mrs. Alvarez said, gripping my hands. "Finally, someone is watching." Mark, always more practical, added, "We need to stay patient. Don't celebrate too early." I nodded. Patience had become a skill I never thought I'd need. As the audit continued, the HOA became visibly uneasy. Meetings that once felt calm now carried tension. Board members whispered in corners, glanced nervously at the crowd, and spent more time explaining their actions. Gloria, the president, who always had a polished smile, now had tight lips and a furrowed brow. I knew the audit was working, even without seeing the full report. One afternoon, I received a call from the reporter I had met weeks before. His tone was cautious but excited. "They're starting to realize the memo is more than just a rumor," he said. "There are discrepancies in their records that could be embarrassing. Nothing illegal yet, but it's not good optics." I thanked him but remained focused on the long game. Embarrassment alone wasn't enough. I needed tangible results, actions that would hold the board accountable. Finally, the audit report arrived. I held the envelope with trembling hands. It was thick, detailed, and precise. I opened it carefully, scanning each page. Discrepancies were highlighted. Multiple approvals did not match official complaint logs. Some votes on the board were not recorded properly. Several projects had been approved while others were penalized for minor, non-existent infractions. The memo, it seemed, had not been an anomaly. It had been a symptom. The report also uncovered something else, a conflict of interest. One board member, Len, had a personal connection with the developer. Projects that favored the developer had been fast-tracked, and complaints from other residents had been dismissed or ignored. The county inspector noted that while there was no evidence of criminal activity, the lack of transparency and the failure to follow proper procedures violated HOA governance rules. I felt a surge of satisfaction. Every late night, every careful note, every conversation with neighbors had led to this moment. This wasn't revenge in the destructive sense. This was calculated justice. And it was undeniable. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled immediately after the audit release. The room was packed. Chairs were lined along the walls, and people were standing shoulder to shoulder. The tension was palpable. I arrived early, folder in hand, prepared to present the facts calmly and clearly. The meeting began with routine introductions. Gloria opened the floor. "We are aware of the audit results," she said, her voice measured. "We are reviewing them carefully." When it was my turn, I stood and spoke slowly, deliberately. I summarized the audit findings, highlighting the discrepancies, the conflict of interest, and the patterns of favoritism. I presented copies of the audit report, the memo, and the supporting documents. My voice was calm, firm, and confident. I did not accuse with anger. I presented facts, letting the evidence speak for itself. A murmur ran through the room. People leaned forward. Board members exchanged uneasy glances. Len, the board member with ties to the developer, looked pale. His fingers drummed nervously on the table. I could see the shift happening. The once confident board now faced scrutiny, and the room held its collective breath. After a pause, a few residents stood to voice their concerns. One by one, they shared personal stories of unfair fines, ignored complaints, and unequal enforcement of rules. The board tried to respond, but their answers were weak, scripted, and insufficient. Each response only confirmed the audit's findings in the eyes of the community. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that something had to change. Gloria called for an emergency vote to remove Len from his position, citing the audit's findings and the clear conflict of interest. The vote passed almost unanimously. Len resigned on the spot, his face a mix of shame and disbelief. The room erupted in a mixture of relief and quiet applause. The atmosphere was surreal. Weeks of careful planning, documentation, and observation had culminated in this moment. The HOA board had been forced to act. Justice, calculated and patient, had been served. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction but also a strange emptiness. The battle had been won, but it had not been easy. After the meeting, neighbors approached me with gratitude. Mrs. Alvarez hugged me tightly, tears in her eyes. Mark shook my hand firmly, a proud smile on his face. People who had previously avoided conflict now spoke openly about fairness and accountability. The community had shifted. A new sense of empowerment was in the air. That night, I sat in my living room, the folder now closed and neatly stored. I thought about the $1,000 fine that had started this journey. What had begun as a personal injustice had transformed into something much larger, a lesson in accountability, transparency, and the power of careful, deliberate action. The HOA had been humbled. The board had learned that power without fairness is fragile. And for the first time, the neighborhood felt like a community again, one where rules mattered equally to everyone. But even as satisfaction settled in, I knew this was not the end. The board would rebuild, policies would change, and some residents would resist. Maintaining fairness would require continued vigilance. And there were still lessons to be learned, small injustices to address, and quiet victories to celebrate. The $1,000 fine had ignited a chain of events that none of us could have predicted. What started as personal frustration had grown into a movement of quiet justice, proving that even in small communities, a single determined person could make a lasting impact. Little did I know, the final act, the ultimate reveal that would shock the entire neighborhood, was still to come. But for now, the board had been humbled, the neighbors empowered, and my secret revenge had worked exactly as intended. The weeks after Len's resignation were strange. The air felt lighter. Yet the tension did not fully leave. People still whispered. People still wondered what else might come out. I felt that too. There was relief. But there was also a hollow place where the fight had been. The county's final notes landed a few days later. They were short. They did not accuse anyone of a crime. They did, however, list failures. Failures to follow bylaws. Failures to log votes correctly. Failures to disclose relationships that should have been disclosed. The language was formal, but the meaning was clear. The HOA had to fix its governance. It had to be transparent. It had to change. At the next general meeting, the board presented a plan. New rules. New checks. A code of conduct for directors. Mandatory disclosures. A rotating system for approvals to reduce conflicts of interest. They promised training. They promised better records. They promised audits every 2 years. The room applauded cautiously. But the real reveal came quietly, behind the scenes. It began with a phone call. A neighbor I barely knew called me one evening. Her voice was shaky. "I found something," she said, "in a box of old receipts." She told me to come over. Her house was small and warm. She had lived here for 30 years. She kept everything in boxes. She showed me a ledger she had found while cleaning. It was old. It was dusty. It had names and numbers and dates. At first I thought it was personal bookkeeping. Then I saw one line that stopped me cold. It matched a date on the memo. The amount was small, but its destination was telling. The ledger showed a payment. Not direct, not in a bank transfer. A check to a catering company. A check that corresponded with a fundraising event. The ledger had been scribbled in a way that made it seem like normal community expenses. But next to the catering company's name, a note read, "Len, thanks." It was a casual note. A careless note. Not a smoking gun. But it was a link. A link between Len and the events that coincided with expedited approvals. I took a photo. I put it with our folder. I felt a wash of emotions. Validation. Anger. A strange pity. The ledger did not prove more than it suggested. But it built on the pattern. It showed how favors might have been repaid in small ways. It showed how lines blurred. We brought the ledger to the new interim board. Their faces were sober. They asked questions. They thanked us for coming forward. They said they would put this document into the audit file. To me, it felt like another stone in the foundation of truth we had built. Then neighbors started telling stories about small favors. A free meal here. A discount there. A board member helping arrange a contractor at a cheaper price. None of it illegal in a strict sense. None of it noble either. It was the kind of thing that erodes trust slowly. It was the kind of thing that makes rules feel like tools rather than protections. A month later, the HOA voted to reimburse fines that had been shown to be incorrectly issued. My $1,000 check was among them. I received a certified letter. They had approved a motion. They had voted to void certain fines and return the money. My name was on a list of several homeowners. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the refund check. It was not the point, rationally. The money was real, but the victory felt deeper. It was a public acknowledgement. It was a reversal. It was an apology in paper form. I drove to the HOA office to pick up the paperwork. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old paint. A woman at the front desk handed me the envelope. Her face was tentative. She said, "On behalf of the board, we are sorry for any distress caused." Her voice was genuine, or as genuine as an official statement can be. I told her it was enough. I didn't want a public spectacle. I wanted rules to be fair. I wanted neighbors to feel safe in their own yards. She nodded. I left. The more visible changes came slowly. The board voted in new members, people who had no ties to developers or contractors. They set up a transparency committee that published minutes online. They posted complaint logs without names but with more detail about outcomes. They changed the approval process so multiple people had to sign off on variances. They held open office hours. Those were small things. They were also big things. People reacted in different ways. Some were relieved. Some were suspicious. A few former supporters of the old board left the neighborhood rather than face the changes. A couple of residents who had benefited from the previous system grumbled. But the majority attended meetings. They asked questions. They held the board to the new standards. As for Len, he moved away quietly. He left without drama. I wondered about him. I felt a mix of anger and empathy. He was not the villain in a movie. He was a man who had let small compromises grow until they became a problem. I hoped he learned. I hoped he would live with what had happened. For me, the conclusion was quieter than I expected. There was no grand courtroom scene. There was no dramatic confession. There was a ledger, a memo, and a county report. Those pieces were small, but together they added up. They forced a change. They held people accountable. That was enough. I kept my folder for a while. It lived in a drawer. Sometimes I took it out and looked through it. The pages smelled faintly of printer ink and coffee. The evidence felt alive. It reminded me of the nights I sat up, the conversations in doorways, the signatures on a petition. It reminded me that action, even small action, can ripple out. Neighbors began to talk differently. At the park, people swapped recipes and stories. At the coffee shop, the talk was less tense. Not everything healed. Some relationships remained strained. Trust, once broken, mends slowly. But there was a thread of civility returning. A few months later, at a community picnic, Gloria, the former president, approached me. Her hair was shorter. She looked tired. She reached out a hand. "Thank you," she said, "for bringing this to light." It was simple. It was awkward. I shook her hand. I thought about revenge. The word felt heavy. What I had wanted at first was not revenge for revenge's sake. I wanted fairness. I wanted to be seen. I wanted the truth to matter. The plan I had imagined in the early days, quiet, methodical, satisfying, had played out in a way I had not fully predicted. It had changed people. It had rebalanced power. In the end, the most satisfying part was not the refund. It was not Len's resignation. It was the way neighbors started to hold each other to account. It was the way conversations shifted from silence and fear to questions and engagement. That shift was the true payoff. On a late Sunday, I walked past my house and looked at the fence I had once been accused of modifying. The paint gleamed in the sun. My yard looked the way I had wanted it to look. It felt like something I had defended, not for vanity, but for home. I ran my hand along the fence rail. It was solid. The house was solid. I did not write a plaque. I did not make a speech. I did not want to be the hero in anyone's story. I wanted normal. I wanted neighbors who felt like neighbors again. That was the quiet goal. That was the quiet victory. Sometimes justice is loud. Sometimes it is quiet. Mine was quiet. It was patient. It was imperfect. But it worked. The HOA learned to follow its own rules. The community learned it could stand up. And I learned that when a small injustice is met with steady resolve, even a single person can change the story. I folded the last page of my folder and put it away. Then I watered my garden. The sun set in soft colors. The neighborhood settled for the evening. For the first time in months, I slept without the tightness in my chest. The fine that started it all was now a story we told at picnics. Not with glee. Not with malice. With a tired sort of pride. We had faced an unfair system. We had fixed it. And the little, ordinary world around us felt better because of it.